Philosophy reveals very clearly that when you start with the self as ultimate, or the I, that is when you say, I'm not interested in God as a presupposition, I'm interested only in the self, in a universe of brute factuality, true knowledge, sure knowledge becomes totally impossible. We are confronted by a limitless array of infinite, brute, unknowable, unrelated, totally irrational facts that are impervious to reason, because there is no relationship between them. They've been thrown out of the womb of chance. If I take a zero, an irrational brute fact thrown out of the womb of chance, and you add to it another billion or 10 billion zeros, what have you got? Zero. It doesn't matter how many zeros you take, there is no established relationship between them. You've got one big fat zero. One might insist that we have being and we'll define our own essence. That's the essence of existentialism. But then we have to grant that every other person in the world has the same right. They too have no definition, no essence, no pre-established pattern, no meaning. And so they too have a right to create a universe unto themselves. So if the non-theist was really consistent with what they believed, nothing could be known. And that is why I've said that the non-theist is an intellectual schizophrenic. They borrow from the theistic worldview continuously to support their own arguments. With brute, uncreated, unrelated facticity as ultimate, and the human mind as the final point of reference, all you have is the irrational particulars out there and arbitrary ideas in your mind that you are trying to relate together. What becomes very clear to me is that whenever you start without God, the very idea of proving anything is absurd, because you've already denied the unity of truth and the possibility of truth. Pragmatists and empiricists have asserted a total irrationalism. Put it another way, unless we hold that in God, who is totally self-sufficient and unconditioned, we have fact and design, reason and fact, prior to and before existence and creation, we are only confronted out there with the irrational, unintelligible idea of brute fact thrown up from the womb of chance. The atheist and existentialist Camus put it well. He said this, and I quote, "I said that the world is absurd, but I was too hasty. The world in itself is not reasonable, that is all that can be said, but what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that links them together. This is all I can clearly discern in this measureless universe where my adventure takes place." Albert Einstein understood this predicament well. Having argued initially that knowledge must start and end with experience, and that propositions derived from logic are empty as regards reality, this is what he said. He said he was confronted with an enigma, and I quote, "How can it be that mathematics, being after all the product of human thought which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality?" In other words, how is it that mathematical equations and relations can bear any resemblance to the world out there? So he said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that the universe is comprehensible. Why on earth should the universe be comprehensible unless there is a God who relates that world out there to my mind? The schizophrenic nature of anti-theism emerges again and again and again. On the one hand, there's the insistence that sound thinking must regard God as non-existent, or that it's an open question. There's the assumption that you can get along in the universe without God. On the other hand, naive realism says there's order, structure, design, purpose, and everybody operates on that assumption. You don't wait for a bus that isn't timetabled to come. You expect that the present will be like the past. You expect to walk out of here and not shoot upwards into space, but actually remain attached to the ground. You expect uniformity and consistency in your experience, but in a chance world, why should you expect that? You've got no right to expect that without God. We reinforce this one more time. The one recourse people might have is to say, in denying God is that somehow, in a manner impossible to prove, these brute, irrational facts, as they evolved from chaos and chance, accidentally developed patterns in some naturalistic process. Interestingly, Richard Dawkins has recently suggested in Expelled that maybe aliens have left a genetic imprint on our genes. But of course, those aliens themselves must be the result of a naturalistic, undirected chance process. This is nonsense. Maybe there is then a universe out there, or maybe there's a multiverse out there, or a vast array of differing patterns, but either way, without God, we can't possibly know. All meanings are just human conventions. They're not objective, they're not absolute in any sense. Because a totally exhaustive knowledge of all facts in the universe at any given moment, of all experience of all events in all of history, from the birth of atoms to the present, is impossible. You can't structure that. With your mind, you can't possibly know that there's pattern meaning in it all. Thus, you can choose your faith tonight. You can ask which one of these views makes sense of your life. One in which you're afloat in a vast ocean of chance, shoreless and bottomless, where no one can know anything as it truly is, or him or herself what they truly are. Or you can accept that God has a total meaning and purpose for reality. Darwin and Freud further developed this, reducing us to our environment and the level of an animal. A primordial urge. Freud said, well, our basic urge as human beings is to eat the father and copulate with the mother. And that's what drives our thinking and our being. Primordial urge, then, is what governs people. You can't have a system of thought in this kind of a universe. System implies an underlying coherence and structure to reality. There are various implications of this. The atheist is finally a prisoner of an impersonal blind forces, isolated in a meaningless array of mindless events. The world is desacralized. You might say that this thing differs from that thing. The atomic arrangement of this thing differs from the atomic arrangement of that thing. But you can't make a value judgment between them. You can say this is different from that, but how can you say this is better than that? This is more right than that. This is more true than that. As Jean-Paul Sartre asserted, man is a useless passion. In killing God, you kill yourself. The moral implications of this he saw very readily. Sartre wrote, Dostoevsky said, if God doesn't exist, everything would be permissible. And that is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist. And as a result, man is forlorn, because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. If existence really does precede essence, that is, if existence comes before any kind of structure or pattern, there is no explaining things away by reference to a fixed and given human nature. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. And thus Sartre said, man is a being whose project is to be God. Ethical subjectivism and ethical relativism leave us defining morality as either what you like or don't like, your preferences based on what kind of cheese you ate the night before, or ethics are purely historically, relatively determined. If you're in this country at that time or in this country at that time, you'd believe the following about ethics. Any appeals to evolution to try and ground ethics are abortive and hopeless. Philosopher Stephen Evans has rightly noted. The moral order does not consist in any such things, that's instincts or feelings. It's not an instinct because it is itself the standard by which we judge our instincts to be good or bad. And it is not merely a social impulse or feeling. People who have dulled their consciences often are in fact obligated to do things, yet have no such feelings of obligation whatsoever. Feelings and obligations cannot be identical. If you've got no transcendent moral source, then how can you possibly make a value judgment between a tyrant or justice, oppression, prejudice,